I am coming to you from my house, so be prepared to be bombarded with cats and dogs. And here's my cat JJ right now, so she will say hello. Say hi, JJ. All right, so guys, we are going to begin reading chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby, and in this chapter, we learn who Gatsby is, and he is a bit mysterious. So if you will go ahead and turn to chapter 4, I am going to begin. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistresses returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who had found out that his nephew was a Von to Hindenburg and a second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me the last drop into that there crystal glass." Once, I wrote down on the empty space of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at the folds and head. This schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities, and those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. Okay, guys, remember throughout that whole summer he had countless parties, and he had the who's who of both East and West Egg, okay? From East Egg, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer upon Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whoever came near, and the Esmes and the Christies, or rather Hubert Ochbach, and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon, for no good reason at all. All right, guys. So I'm going to kind of skip over some of these names because I think you kind of get the point that it is the who's who. And ultimately, we are going to learn that Gatsby was really throwing all these parties to try to get in touch with Gatsby. Okay, so I'm going to have you go ahead and turn down to where it says at 9 o'clock one morning. Okay, so the thing to know about this is there were people that came from East Egg and West Egg. However, those East Eggers still really kind of turned up their nose at Gatsby and Gatsby's hospitality, yet they felt no qualms in really using him. Okay. At 9 o'clock one morning, late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with the resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. Okay, guys, so note this about Gatsby. Okay, there's something going on. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and super boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass, and in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So he's not real deep. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded and had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came the disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. Okay, so his speech is not so eloquent anymore. Are we starting to really know who the real Gatsby is? "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me anyhow?" All right, so chapter 4 for Gatsby Two-Face, this is where you really need to start paying attention and taking notes. A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which the question deserved. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me for all those stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversations in his halls. "I'll tell you the God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. Okay, so is this God's truth? Is Nick a reliable narrator? Is Nick telling us everything Gatsby said? "I am the son of some very wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase, "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it or choked on it as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. Okay, so remember yesterday when we were talking about the Two Faces of Gatsby, chapter 1 through 3, how he sounded like this ideal man. He's rich, he has a big house, there's something beautiful about him, he's sensitive. All right, so now we're learning that there is something that is so trusting. There's something a bit sinister, maybe a bit evil. Maybe he has done things wrong in the past. "What part of the Middle West?" I inquired casually. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died, and I came into a great good deal of money." His voice was solemn, as if the memory of the sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment, I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. "After that, I lived like a young Rajah in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago." Ooh, what do you think that could be? Something very sad. Something bad happened to him in his past. Lost love. We don't know. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character, leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bouge de Boulogne. Okay, so Nick is like, this is just too good to be true. This didn't happen. This is a really great made-up story. Nick is calling his bluff. He's saying this is a bunch of baloney. Then came the war, old sport. Remember World War I. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enhanced life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry could advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men, with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. Okay, really? I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration, even Montenegro, little Montenegro down in the Adriatic Sea. Okay, so he just skipped over the whole rank of captain. Sounds like a pretty grand story. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with a smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstance which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell on my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordere de Danilo ran the circular legend. Montenegro, Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Okay, really, I think anybody can really acquire a medal from somewhere and have it engraved. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in the archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby looking a little, not much younger than, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. Okay, so Nick is a bit gullible, are we not? He's a bit gullible. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace of the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease, with their crimson lighted depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. Okay, guys, so seriously, you need to talk amongst yourselves. What is this sad thing? He has foreshadowed this like 3 times. He tried to die. He has a big request of him. Something sad has happened to him. Okay, did he lose a love? He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry. I'd even set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. Okay, guys, so Gatsby is no longer in the safety of his car. He's no longer in West Egg. He's going to the city, so he's putting that face back on. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. Okay, so remember, the Valley of Ashes is home to George and Myrtle Wilson, and Myrtle is Tom's mistress. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. All right, Hood Sport, called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby, excuse me. Okay, so what just happened? Gatsby was pulled over because he was speeding. The policeman came up to Gatsby. Gatsby gave him this little card, and the policeman was like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, sir. This will never happen again. What do you think? Has Gatsby bribed the police department with something? What was that? I inquired. The picture of Oxford. I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me Christmas cards every year. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, and the first wild promises of all the mystery and beauty in the world. Okay, so they're crossing into New York. A dead man passed us in a hearse, heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and the short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud at the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now, and we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. Okay, guys, so I do want you to remember back to really we have the two faces of Gatsby, and we really have the 2 faces of the 1920s. So we have this one face of rich and glamour and money and everything that goes along with it. And then we had this side that was how the other half lived. And we read the poem Strange Fruit, and how many people were discriminated against. Many people did not have this kind of money. Okay, so I want you to remember that as we read. Okay, that appearance, the appearance versus what is reality. All right. Roaring noon, in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. "Mr. Carroway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsham." A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. Okay, so remember when we, before we started reading The Great Gatsby, how we were talking about some of the characters, and you had to do that scavenger hunt, and I told y'all to pay attention to Arnold Rothstein, and you learned that he was a gambler, and he fixed I believe it was the 1919 World Series. Okay, so Mayor Wolfsham is written after Rothstein, okay? "So I took one look at him," said Mr. Wolfsham, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. "I handed the money to Catspaw," he said, and I said, "All right, Catspaw, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth." He shut it then and there. Okay. What's he talking about? Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsham swallowed a new sentence. He was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. "Highballs?" asked the head waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Wolfsham, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling. "But I like across the street better." "Yes, highballs," agreed Gatsby. And then to Mr. Wolfsham, "It's too hot over there." "Hot and small, yes," said Mr. Wolfsham, "but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole." "The old Metropole," brooded Mr. Wolfsham gloomily. "Filled the faces dead and gone. Filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I lived that night they shot Rosie Rothenstall there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had to eat, and drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says, 'Somebody wants to speak to him outside.' 'All right,' says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled him down in his chair. 'Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you so help me move outside this room.' It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and then, as if we'd raised the blinds, we'd see daylight. 'Did he go?' I asked innocently. 'Sure he went.' Mr. Wolfsham's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, 'Don't let the waiter take away my coffee.' Then he went on outside, and they shot him 3 times in his full billy and drove away." All right, so organized crime. Who is this Wolfsham, and why is Gatsby associating with him? 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becker. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. I understand you're looking for a business negotiation. What business negotiation? The juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. Oh, no, he explained. This isn't the man. No, Mr. Wolfsham seemed disappointed. This is just a friend I told you we'd talk about some other time. I beg your pardon, said Mayor Wolfsham. I had the wrong man. A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsham, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all over the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered, and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing underhand. Okay, so can you see how Nick's thinking that this is something that's going to be illegal? Just seeing who Gatsby is associating himself with. All right. Oh, it's nothing underhand, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't all right. She cheats all the time. Suddenly, he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsham at the table. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsham, following with his eyes. Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman. Yes. He's an Oxford man. Oh? He went to Oxford College in English. You know Oxford College. I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby for a long time? I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah. He flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Yeah. Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsham drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. I have enjoyed my lunch, he said, and I'm going to run off from you 2 young men before I outstay my welcome. Don't hurry, Mayor, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsham raised his hand in a sort of benediction. You're very polite, but I belong from another generation, he announced solemnly. You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your... He supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. As for me, I'm 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer. As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, exclaimed Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway. Who is he anyhow, an actor? No. A dentist? Mayor Wolfsham? No, he's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added coolly. He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Fixed the World Series? I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919. But if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened. The end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. Stop, Patch, stop. Sorry, my cat's eating my decorations. How did he happen to do it? I asked after a minute. He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? No. They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught a sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. Come along with me for a minute, I said. I've got to say hello to someone. When he saw us, Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. Daisy's furious because you haven't been to call. This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan. They shook hands briefly, and strained, unfamiliar looks of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. How have you been anyhow? Demanded Tom to me. How'd you happen to come up here this far? I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby. I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. All right, so this is about where it's going to get good. One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker, that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. Okay, so we have change of scenery. Jordan and Nick are together. I was walking along from one place to another, half the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles. All right, guys, say hi to Patch. Say Patch is being very bad. Patch is not letting Mommy read. Can you say bye? Can you say bye? I love you. Bye-bye. I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind. And whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tut-tut-tut-tut in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. Okay, so we're going back a few years. We're learning about Daisy's past. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a little white roadster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night, anyways, for hours. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. Hello, Jordan, she called unexpectedly. Please come here. I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the girls I admired her most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross to make bandages. I was. Okay, so remember right now we're in the midst of World War I. Well then, would I tell them that she couldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at. Sometimes, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered that incident ever since. His name was Jay Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bags one winter night to go to New York and to say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. Okay, so this gentleman that she was trying to go say goodbye to in New York, I think we can all pretty much assume it was Gatsby. And she was prevented from her mother. Okay, so Daisy lives in the South, and she is wealthy. They have an old name. And her mother was like, absolutely not. You are not going up here to say goodbye to a man who has no name for himself. By the next autumn, she was gay again. Gay as ever. She had a debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago, with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired the whole floor of the Seawalk Hotel, and the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. That's like millions of dollars today. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed, as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of saturine in one hand and a letter in the other. "Gratulate me," she muttered. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it." "What's the matter, Daisy?" I was scared, I can tell you. I had never seen a girl like that before. "Here, dearies," she groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take them downstairs and give them back to whoever they belong to. Tell them Daisy's changed her mind. Say Daisy changed her mind." She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day, at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan, without so much as a shiver, and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he had left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstract expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. This was August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too, because her arm was broken, and she was one of the chambermaids at the Santa Barbara Hotel. All right, so Tom has been philandering around for years. This isn't the first time he's had an affair. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes and later in Duval, and then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild. But she came out with absolutely perfect reputation. Perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for armor at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down, and behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of little girls already gathered like crickets on the grass rose through the hot twilight. "I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep." It was a strange coincidence, I said. But it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Okay, guys, like, this is absurd. Okay, this is how much he loves her, how much he's obsessed with her. He bought a house across the bay so he could by chance meet Daisy and then prove his worth to her. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't you ask to arrange a meeting? Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained. And your house is right next door. Okay, so he wants Daisy to see that he has made something of himself, that he can offer her the same things that any other wealthy man can do. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Can you hear my cats running around? Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have seen the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though. He said he'd read a Chicago paper for years, just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and we dipped under a little bridge. I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt with universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. Think about that quote we're going to talk about in a little bit. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, then the facade of 59th Street. A block of delicate pale light beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding sights. And so I drew up the girl beside me, tightened my arm around her. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up against closer, this time, to my face. All right. So we have learned Gatsby's supposed truth. I don't know what to think, and I'm sure you don't either. Do you believe him? Do you not believe him? Do you think parts of his story is real? We also got to learn a great deal about Daisy. And in Chapter 5, we get to see them come together. So, if you're as excited as I am and want to read ahead, by all means do. All right, so signing off. I will see you all mañana. Have a wonderful evening.